Hey, so I heard you took a trip to the Keys. How was that?
It was great. I actually got to see a pine Rockland ecosystem for the first time.
Did you know that the pine Rockland ecosystem is actually a threatened ecosystem?
Really? How are they threatened?
Wait a minute. What actually is a pine Rockland ecosystem?
What a rockin' question. Pine rocklands are an ecosystem mostly made up of limestones in a subtropical habitat on high ground, which is very dry. They can be found in South Florida, the Florida Keys, and the Caribbean.
Well, let's get to the root of what defines this pine habitat. They have a limited amount of soil with limestone at the surface, and they are often wet for short periods. An open canopy of South Florida slash pine can be found, along with an abundance of saw palmettos.
Oh, are saw palmettos common there?
That would be correct. They are very common. They have a sharp stalk and pointed leaves. I believe Native Americans sometimes use them for food.
Well, don't leave me hanging. What else characterizes this ecosystem?
It has little to no shade, and there's a lot of open space, with most of the vegetation there being low to the ground.
I'm gonna guess that's a result of fire?
Yes, in fact, fire is very important for this ecosystem. Pines require sufficient sunlight in order to grow properly. In the absence of fire, grasses and hardwood trees would overgrow, and the lack of sunlight would prevent pine seedlings from being able to sprout. Long term, the absence of fire would likely result in the pine rockland changing into a hardwood hammock.
Oh wow, that would be a pretty dark outcome.
So, what stops the fire from destroying the pine trees and pine seedlings?
Great question. So, pine trees have adapted to the presence of fires. They have thick bark, which helps to protect them from fires. Their branches are also closer to the tops of the trees, making it harder for the fire to reach the branches and needles.
And after the fire, the pine seeds have an easier time sprouting due to the absence of competition. The seedlings also try to focus their energy on growing underground while they're still young.
So why underground?
Well, to simplify, while still small, these trees are highly susceptible to fire. If another blaze comes through the area, the whole above ground portion of the tree could perish. If the tree has a large root system, it can bounce back from this. Otherwise, the young tree would be toast.
Okay, so I have a burning question. I haven't heard of any fires in this part of Florida. Are these areas being burnt, regularly?
Oh, I'm stoked you asked. Tree ring data has shown us that fire used to be more prevalent in pine rockland ecosystems in Big Pine Key before 1957, when the National Key Deer Refuge was established.
Oh, I've heard about that. The National Key Deer Refuge was made to protect the key deer, which is an endangered species, right?
Yup. It was made to protect the key deer specifically. Those critters weren't considered federally endangered when it was made, though.
So, one could say that the National Key Deer Refuge was key to deer restoration practices, right?
Well, it was certainly important.
Anyway, fire historically used to be used as a part of deer hunting practices, and the National Key Deer Refuge places restrictions on hunting practices in order to protect the key deer. It is thought that the decrease in fire prevalence in pine rockland ecosystems is largely due to this restriction of deer hunting practices.
Also, Big Pine Key used to contain little residential development, at least prior to 1950, so fire used to be a more realistic option for hunting. With the increase in residential development and the establishment of the National Key Deer Refuge, which protects deer from hunting, fire isn't as common as it used to be in the landscape.
Yeah, overall, the change in fire frequency has had large consequences because fire is an important and necessary part of the pine rockland ecosystem. The lack of fires also causes fire fuel loads to build up, which ultimately leads to fires that are overly destructive when fires do occur.
Exactly, which is precisely why prescribed burning practices have been put in place by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect this ecosystem. But even with these practices in place, fire was still more common in this ecosystem prior to about 1957.
This is interesting to me because I think overall, this is an example of how one conservation effort may oppose another conservation effort. The key deer is a federally endangered species that needs to be protected. But the conservation efforts that were put in place to protect key deer had a negative impact on fire frequency. I think this is an example that shows how it's much easier to protect an ecosystem than to try to restore it to what it once was.
Yes, intervening with restoration efforts is difficult and could have unexpected consequences due to how intricate ecosystems are and how crude our understanding is of the inner workings of different ecosystems.
Is there anything else that's threatening the pine rocklands?
Yes. At lower elevations, pine rocklands have been seen to exhibit the effects of sea level rises.
Okay, what are we doing to combat this?
Researchers are still getting their feet wet tackling this issue. Species translocation involving plants has been considered, though so far it has been unsuccessful and oftentimes considered a last resort in conservation.
I see.
Also, with the increase in sea levels, researchers have a sinking feeling that the Florida Keys will experience a decline in the landscape and species diversity.
What effect does the rising sea levels have on the upland communities?
Well, the plants living there have really been blown out of the water. Species in upland communities have been replaced by simpler mangrove communities. A pattern like this occurs in many other low-lying ecosystems with short supply of fresh water.
To add insult to injury, affected soils may remain inhospitable for generations. This further demonstrates the need to be proactive in conservation efforts. Although salt cures meat, it kills plants and poisons soils.
That's still not even half the story. What's really interesting is that pine rocklands serve as a habitat for many endemic species of South Florida and the Florida Keys. To rub salt in the wounds, numerous species are restricted to a limited range, which then makes them at risk from storms and other abiotic stresses. These species will be facing extinction if or when the ecosystem disappears due to sea level rise, along with other impacts of climate change.
The impacts of rising sea level, salinity exposure, and storm events can lead to a reduction or even complete loss of critical plant species. The Miami blue butterfly, for example, is losing the land it lives on and the plants on which it feeds. At the rate this ecosystem is declining, this butterfly will soon be facing extinction.
Wow, that really stinks. Are these the only threats the native species are facing?
You wish. That doesn't yet take into account the invasive species encroaching on pine rocklands. Many invasive plants and animals have taken up residence in this ecosystem. They are causing an increased competition for resources, which makes it difficult for the native species to thrive.
The growing masses of dense invasive vegetation are making once healthy land unsuitable for natives.
And they further isolate plant and animal communities, causing an increase in habitat fragmentation.
To make matters worse, the aforementioned reduction of fire frequency has further spurred on the growth of hardwood species and the proliferation of invasive species. When it comes to invasive species, despite having significantly lower species richness for exotic species than for native species, some studies have shown that the land area occupied by each category is nearly equal.
I don't really understand. Can you give me an example of one of these studies?
Well, I can. The grass species Reineke repens is a growing threat in pine rocklands. In a study assessing the impact of R. repens on native species diversity, it was shown that increasing density of this exotic grass was associated with significant reduction in varieties of native species.
How exactly is R. repens responsible for the reduction of native species?
At densities above 30% ground cover, grass and sedge diversity is reduced by a statistically significant measure because of the amount of R. repens present. Since an estimated 23% of the species richness in pine rocklands is composed of grasses and sedges, the spread of R. repens needs to be halted as soon as possible.
Okay, I'm starting to understand how invasive species can be a huge problem. What else can you tell me?
Well, in another study, the impact of introducing prescribed burns to a pine rockland was evaluated.
What were the researchers able to learn from a study like that?
It was concluded that invasive species did not vary in richness post-burn, but abundances of these species were altered. Some came back stronger post-burn, while other species were severely reduced in numbers.
How would you even apply a conclusion like that to the problem? It seems kind of two-sided to me.
Information like this is currently being used to plan invasive plant removal programs. In the hard-to-eradicate species that can be reduced by fire, it may be beneficial to burn the target areas before attempting other forms of more resource-intensive eradication. But this solution still requires much consideration and some alteration, as other invasives might benefit from fire, and that could negate the benefits of the burn.
Yeah, so theoretically, species most harmful to endemic plants can be traded for less damaging, although still invasive, alternatives. There would have to be a many-angled approach to ensure ongoing effects of this habitat restoration method, but it is one of the more promising avenues of research.
Come hell or high water, land management groups are determined to find solutions to the many threats facing pine rocklands. One way to combat this issue would be to remove an invasive species before it's able to completely establish.
Another restorative act would be to use plant stock that is adaptable in its response to climate change. Species with a higher salt tolerance, for example, would better endure the coming environmental crisis.
That's very insightful. I can really understand why the pine rockland is considered a threatened ecosystem. Just to make sure I've got the key concepts down, can we review some of them?
Heck yeah, let's go for it.
So, the pine rockland ecosystem is mainly spread throughout South Florida, the Florida Keys, and the Caribbean. Also, they have little to no shade with vegetation that is close to the ground.
Pretty much. Also, be sure to remember that fire ecology plays an important role in maintaining the ecosystem. Over time, the frequency of fires has decreased, which has resulted in a buildup of fire fuel loads. This caused the fires to be overly destructive.
Just to make sure I'm on track as well, fire was also used as a deer hunting practice for the native key deer. The establishment of the key deer refuge introduced many restrictions on the hunting of the dearly beloved key deer, extinguishing the use of fire as a hunting practice.
Spot on. Since pine rocklands are primarily located in the Florida Keys, other problems they are facing is a rise in sea level, which reduces the already small land area and decreases overall species diversity.
The ecosystem transitions with the rising sea level to resemble more of a mangrove ecosystem. Native species face extinction because the salinity of the area around them begins to change to a level that they are not able to adapt to.
Correct. Keep in mind that invasive species are a major threat to the pine rockland ecosystem as well. Some studies have shown that the species richness is split approximately in half between invasive and native species.
What was the name of that one invasive species again? It was R. repens, right?
Bingo. R. repens is causing a significant decrease in grass and sedge diversity in areas with more than 30% grass cover. Grasses and sedges are estimated to account for 23% of the species richness in pine rocklands, so this is clearly an issue.
Wow. Who would have thought that we could learn so much about an ecosystem just because you took a trip to the Florida Keys?
I know, right? Thank you guys so much.
No problem.
Yeah, no problem.